Okay. Okay, this meeting is now being recorded. If you don't want to have your voice or face recorded, please mute yourself or take off your video, and we'll go ahead and run.
If everybody could mute their audio so that background noises don't make the screen jump around. Let's see here. Okay. So let me get our screen set up. So I'm going to share my entire screen. Okay. This could be a field day site, looking out into the stars. There we go. Except, can you see that black bar across the top? Nobody knows what I'm talking about.
I don't see a black bar. I see
Good.
QRP or QRO.
It's on my screen, but you don't see it. That's because I'm sharing. Okay. Fellow ARCA club members, the title of today's little presentation is called QRP Reconsidered. And I open with the question, do you QRP or do you QRO? And you're probably saying, what the hell is he talking about? What's a QRP or a QRO? Well, I don't think it was required to pass your license exam, but as operating procedure, I think you should know the Q codes. If you've never been there before, then go to the ARRL website and look up the Q codes. QRM means I'm being interfered with. QRN Nancy means I'm getting noise. QSB means fading, etc., etc. For today, however, I want to talk about QRP versus QRO. Now, QRO basically means high power. QRP, turns out the RP stands for reduced power. If I say QRP question mark, I'm saying, should I reduce power? And if you think I should reduce power, you send back QRP, meaning, yes, you should reduce power. Well, it turns out, if we rewind the video back to October, I was trying to set up a California QSO party event for the club, K6QLF, and I couldn't get a site that had security enough that we could go for 30 hours. I backpedaled and decided to change what I did. So for the California QSO party, I offered up some hours to run remotely into November X-ray 6 Tango. I reserved the call sign kilowatt 6 Quebec to run from my location here in Concord, and I ran it as 100 watts. However, I put a third signal on the air for my own call sign, Whiskey Quebec 6 X-ray. I dialed the power level back on the FT2000 down to 5 watts. And I ran the California QSO party as a 5-watt QRP station. That went so well, I think I'm going to set a high score record for Contra Costa County running QRP power. I'll say more about that a little later. Since October, I have done a number of QRP events, and that's what led to this morning's presentation. Now, notice that I put here on the screen a quote from Part 97.313 of the FCC regulations states, An amateur station may use the minimum transmitter power necessary to carry out the desired communications. I said may, must, it is must. So technically, you're violating the spirit of this regulation if you're talking to your buddy down the block and you're running your kilowatt amplifier to do so. This is a regulation that can't be enforced. So I don't worry about it. And some people feel they must run with an amplifier. Some people say, I don't believe in amplifiers, and they have big issues with the guys with amplifiers. And some people actually prefer to play the QRP game. What is QRP? QRP power is defined as 5 watts or less. Technically, 10 watts PEP. In a lot of radio contests, they have 3 categories. They have high power, which is anything over 100 watts. They have a low power, which is 100 watts all the way down to 5 watts. And then they have a third category, QRP power, 5 watts or less. This year, the ARRL made a change to contest rules. Up until this year, low power was considered 150 watts or less. But most of the other contests said low power was 100 watts or less. So the ARRL has changed the overall contest rules now for contests like the RIDI Roundup, which just happened, and Field Day coming up. Low power is now 100 watts or less. Back in 2014, I made an expedition on the island of St. Croix. My friend George, N6GEO, he put the equipment together. It was his idea. I basically went along as an operator, and at the end, I wrote it up. We ran a Flex radio, a Flex 1500. It's a little box. It's very small. Puts out 5 watts, as it turns out. It's a perfect QRP radio. It's a software-defined radio. So if you want to run the radio, you have to run a program called Power SDR, which puts up a big picture on your screen, and it'll let you do just about anything that radio can do. Well, we wanted to run as low power, so we took the Flex radio and we ran it into a Tokyo high power HL45B amplifier, which produces about 9 watts. Produces about 45 watts, which is a 9 times power increase. I'm going to talk about power increases in a moment. The output of the Tokyo high power basically drove a kilowatt amplifier to run at 149.49 watts. How do I know it was exactly 149.49? We had a watt meter on the end of it, a digital watt meter, and that's what we tuned it for. Today, the RIDI Roundup has a power limit of 100 watts, so we would have done it differently. We thought of running QRP then, but it's really tricky. However, when you're a DX station, Whiskey Papa 2/WQ6X, people are looking to work you. So in retrospect, wouldn't it have been cool if we had run it as a 5 watt operation? Nevertheless, we took first place worldwide running on that station. Recently, I have written a number of blog entries about the QRP concept. If you go to wq6x.blogspot.com, I'll put a link in the chat at the end of this. You will see the latest things that I've written. And it all started with the California QSO party. I then said, could we do the same thing with sweepstakes? So I registered the W6Q call sign. And again, I put in some time for November X-ray 6 Tango. Then I ran Whiskey 6 Quebec at 100 watts. And interspersed throughout the weekend, I ran WQ6X as a QRP station. A couple of weeks later, I ran QRP in the CQ Worldwide CW contest. Then in December, I ran the 10-meter contest. I did the same thing, another triple operation. I put in hours for NX6T. I reprised the kilowatt 6 Tango call sign for that event. T stands for 10 meters, basically. A dozen years ago, I ran kilowatt 6 Tango and did some very interesting things with it. So I wanted to reprise the call sign for that event in last year. And then again, interspersed with all of that, I ran Whiskey Quebec 6 X-ray as a QRP station and took a first place in that category. After that, I got ballsy and got access to the antenna system I'm going to show you a picture of in a moment. The antennas at Whiskey Alpha 6 Tango Quebec Tango, they've got an antenna farm down there. I ran the Stu Perry 160-meter contest QRP, but I had a tri-square vertical array. Those vertical elements are 120 feet high because quarter wave for 160 meters is 120-foot vertical. Then in January this year, I ran the RIDI Roundup, a QRP. And then the last 2 weekends, I ran the North American QSO party, and I ran that QRP. So there's a lot of things that can be done QRP. Some people think this is QRP. Nothing wrong with this. It looks like it could be a pretty fun thing to play around with, but I'm certainly not going to run a radio contest with this unit. Has it ever occurred to you that there's another way to run QRP? This happens to be the Yaesu FT2000 radio that I have sitting over here to my right. This radio could be any radio. So if you've got a Kenwood 590, or you've got an ICOM 7, what's the new one that's come out? The ICOM 7300, the ICOM 7300 or the ICOM 7610, all of those radios can be dialed back to 5 watts. Somebody got mad at me a few months ago and said, well, it really isn't QRP because you're running 120-foot verticals. Their definition of QRP is low power and a crummy antenna. Wrong, 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 wrong. The definition of QRP makes no statement one way or another about what kind of antenna you're using. QRP simply means I'm running 5 watts or less. So here's the disadvantages of QRO running high power. Amplifiers aren't cheap unless you buy one used. Somebody recently got I forget what kind of amplifier it was. He got it for free. If you get it for free, there's a reason. And right after that, one or both of the final tubes failed. And those tubes are $273 a piece. So that free amplifier cost them $500 for tubes. Tube amps can weigh more than 100 pounds. Solid state can weigh over 50 pounds. Requires a lot of desk space. Lots of electricity. Your electricity bill is going to go up. And high voltages and amplifiers can kill you. Fact of life. So what is the benefits or cost of either upping your power or reducing your power? Well, our friend, the decibel, can tell us all about it. Probably in your license exam studies for your license exam, you came across decibels. Basically, to not get into a lot of math about it, decibels are reporting a ratio of one number versus another number, voltage versus voltage, power versus power. And depending upon how much of a change you have will determine the decibel difference. Today, most radios run at 100 watts. There are some of the newer radios that are coming in from China, they're all running 5 watts, 10 watts, 20 watts. The Elecraft KX2 and KX3, they run anywhere from 10 to 20 watts. But the average transceiver you buy runs 100 watts. I showed you a picture of my Yaesu FT2000. That's a 100 watt radio. So in order to make a single S unit difference, the theory is that a S unit difference means that a 6 decibel change has occurred. So in order to be heard from an S5 to an S6, that requires a 6 decibel change. And that means if you look over across from 6 dB, that means you have to increase your power 4 times to make a difference that nobody will hear. Most people can't tell the difference between S5 and S6 or S7 and S8. What if you want to get a 2 decibel increase where you're going to have to up your power by over 10? We'll come back to this. So power increases, as I just said, is 6 dB improvement is equivalent to a single S unit. A power increase, taking your 100 watt transmitter and running it into one of your big amplifiers, will give you almost a 2 S unit improvement. Increasing your power from 5 watts to 1500 will give you a 4 S unit increase. Well, what does that really look like? See that red line? Assume that that's sitting right on S1. Notice what a 2 S unit difference looks like from S1 to S3, and a 4 unit difference from S1 to S4. So it turns out using a lot of power doesn't give you back what you might think. Likewise, reducing power isn't as bad as you think. If you take your radio, as I've been doing, at 100 watts and turn it down to 5 watts, you're reducing your signal by almost 2 S units. So if you were S9 before, you're now an S7. If you were S7, you're now an S5. Let's look at that again. There, you can see the difference between S5, where the 4 is, and an S9, which is the middle of the scale. You see, I was under the belief that if you run QRP power, nobody can hear you. In fact, this weekend, I've been running the CQ 160 meter contest. They've been giving me some access to the station in Anza, and I'm running QRP 5 watts into their tri-square vertical array. Dennis N6KI said, "You're a glutton for punishment." And then he worked me from San Diego, and he texted me and said, "How much power are you running?" I said, "I'm running 5 watts. He says, "Well, you're really loud here." I said, "It ain't the power, it's the antenna." So what can we do to compensate for the dB loss when we go down to QRP? One thing you can do is use a gain antenna. Here at the portable location in Concord, I have up on a pole about 30 foot high, a high gain single band 10 meter, it's called a long john Yagi. It's 3 elements, and it gives me about 7.5 dB gain, a little over 2 S units improvement. Another thing you can do to overcome the losses of QRP is operate from a high elevation QTH. Where I'm running from remotely this weekend is up on a mountaintop in Ramona, California, down in the San Bernardino Mountains. So being up on the mountain gives me a downward look at the people I'm trying to communicate with. Also, hard to believe, in a contest, search and pounce, looking for stations and calling them, may not be the best way to go when you're a QRP station. Because if there's a pileup waiting to get in, you don't stand a chance. So in fact, it turns out, and I've done a lot of this last night, find a quiet frequency and call CQ. Let people come to you. Then you don't have to worry about it. Now, the caveat of that is that because you're running low power, a lot of people won't hear you and they'll move right on in. I had people go down a half a KC below me and start calling CQ. I have a function key that's pre-programmed to send QRL, QSY. QRL means the frequency is in use. QSI means leave. But we say it nicely with QRL, QSY. And if they don't get that, I have another function key programmed to say QRL, QSY, lid, LID. A lid is a poor operator. I've written blogs, you can find them on my blog system, describing why we should listen before we transmit. Anytime I go to start a new frequency, I listen to see if anybody's there. If I don't hear anybody, I send QRL question mark, which is my way of saying, is the frequency in use? And if I don't get a reply back to that, I can then call CQ. But last night, that's not what they were doing. They didn't hear me, so they called CQ. And I would send QRL, QSY. And most of the time, they would vacate. So QRP, you need room around you where there's nobody crowding you and overriding your signal. And to make QRP work, you need to understand band propagation. You need to know what bands are most likely opened at what time of the day. The success I've had running QRP in the last few weeks comes from that Yagi, that 10-meter Yagi, and starting on 10 meters in the day and working my way down. So on 10 meters, I get the Yagi. It turns out I just recently installed an MFJ IntelliTuner. Turns out that IntelliTuner can tune the 10-meter 3-element Yagi as a 15-meter dipole. And I can actually turn it just like so it becomes a rotatable dipole. And I didn't know if that would work with QRP, but it turns out that it does. So know what bands are best open for that time of day, and that's what you should work. And in general, know that the higher bands will close out. So you'll go from 10 meters down to 15, down to 20. And then at some point in the early evening, go down to 40, down to 80 if you can. Antennas and location make the difference with QRP. Here's the 3-element Yagi that I've been running at W7AYT. Very simple, but it gets the job done. Then over on the right, you can see we call it a tri-square. It's actually only 3 verticals. We have an 80-meter 4-square, which is 4 verticals basically in a square shape. And the phasing lines allow you to switch directions immediately. Boom. 4 squares are expensive for 160 meters. So in fact, a lot of people run, they call them 3 squares. They're in a triangular shape, but they accomplish the same thing. This 3-square array that you can see, it turns out the southeast leg has been dead. So I've been running 2/3 of a 3-square for a few weeks. And we were told last night that the control cable to allow us to switch directions doesn't work. So last night on 160, I ran with the antenna pointing literally northeast. Now, amazingly, I managed to get Hawaii off the backside. I got Cayman Islands and V31 Belize somehow off the edge of the antenna. But antennas make the difference. They really do. Now, here's some things to consider, and I learned this the hard way. Determine how much power you're actually running by putting the watt meter as far away from the radio as you can, as close to the antenna as you can. When I ran CQP as a QRP station back in October, I went to the power level knob on the radio and I turned it down, and a little thing on the screen said I was running at 5 watts. So I just assumed I was running at 5 watts. When I put the IntelliTuner into the line, which has a watt meter on it, it turns out I was actually putting out 2.2 watts. So I ran that entire QRP. I've been running these QRP exercises until January when I brought in the IntelliTuner. I've been running them at about 2.5 watts the entire time. I didn't know that. So don't rely on what your transceiver tells you power level wise. Let the watt meter actually tell you. The contests say QRP is 5 watts of output power. The power watt meter will tell me how much power I'm actually putting out. Keep your SWR down below 1.5. As that SWR goes up, you start losing power. You're already down to 5 watts. So you can't really afford to lose much more than that. Make sure that everything is properly grounded. You need to do whatever you need to do to achieve maximum power transfer to that antenna because you're already at a disadvantage. If you can rotate your antennas, point your antennas to exactly where it is you want to be heard. Remember that while verticals are nice antennas, they have no gain or directionability. Which, by the way, is why I'm not going to discuss VHF and QRP today, because VHF pretty much is often done as QRP. Most handy-talkies are QRP. I'll let someone else talk about that. And on VHF, we use verticals a lot. But for HF, remember that verticals have no gain and they have no directionality. Unless you phase several verticals, as we did with the tri-square or vertical array, then you get gain. Here's some final things to consider. when calling CQ, let the world know that you're running QRP power. Why not? I checked the contest rules on that. There's no ruling one way or another, whether or not I can say it the way I say it. So I make a CQ call, signing my call sign once, and then signing my call sign /QRP. Lets everybody know that I'm QRP. And you know, when you do that, it's amazing how many people will give you a clear frequency. I love it because people are used to my call sign in contests running 100 watts, and now they're all doing a double take. That's why I purposely registered 1-by-1 calls to run 100 watts and ran my personal call sign as QRP, because people know my call sign. They just don't know the power level that I'm normally running. I got the idea to run many contests QRP because I went to the results page for these contests and found out that the competition level in QRP was way, way down, and that therefore it might not be difficult to get a high score running as QRP. It wasn't until last weekend that I took the chance to run a sideband contest QRP. I was under the mistaken belief that running QRP sideband, nobody's going to hear me. They won't be able to understand me. But then you see these guys running their parks on the air. They're running 5-watt sideband, and they're talking to the entire country. The NAQP contest is largely a domestic contest, US and Canada, although we can talk to other areas. With RTTY contests, I chose to run the RTTY Roundup this year as QRP because we have an advantage in a way in that the decoder software on the other end, the guy you're trying to talk to, can often pull signals out and decode them when they might not be able to decode a sideband signal or even a CW signal. So here's the bottom line. It ain't how much power you run, it's how effective you operate with that power that matters. What I've learned is that QRP is nothing to be afraid of. I'm not saying I won't eventually pick up an amplifier. I'm thinking about it. But as a matter of fact, when I ran the decibel numbers on it and saw what it was costing me or what it would cost me and what I would gain by running QRO, I've decided that I'm going to consider QRP, which is why I wrote a blog recently entitled QRP Reconsidered. This talk today is entitled QRP Reconsidered. Now I'd like to open it up for questions if you have any. I will put the a link to my blog in the chat.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. Anyone
we
have
are.
any other questions or anything else?
WQ6x.blogspot.com. I've had this blog going since 2013. My contest blog, I report the different contests that I play around in and various ideas. For example, I use a method here called stereo CW. If you want to know more about stereo CW, go to my blog and there's a little search engine up in the top left corner and type in stereo CW. Or if you want to know more about QRP, type in QRP. That's where the list of all the things I've done on QRP came from. When I wrote this PowerPoint, I got to thinking, well, what have I been doing with QRP lately? And I did the search engine in my blog to look things up.
Okay, thank you, Ron.
Thank you.